Please be advised that this video covers sensitive topics and includes photographs and audio demonstrating the suffering that followed Hurricane Katrina. It may be difficult for some audiences to watch.
Hi, my name is Eileen Tomzuk, and I'm the Education Coordinator at the Louisiana State Museum. You might be wondering, why is this broken piano in a museum? This piano belonged to Fats Domino. Fats Domino was a New Orleans musician who helped create rock and roll. He inspired artists like Elvis Presley and the Beatles. He even had 37 top 40 singles, which is the same number Beyonce has as of 2020. Fats Domino's home flooded during Hurricane Katrina. He survived, but he lost almost everything, including this piano. The piano is a symbol of the loss suffered by many during Hurricane Katrina. I'm going to take you on a tour of the exhibition, Living with Hurricanes, Katrina and Beyond. We'll find out what happened during and after Hurricane Katrina. Why was the storm's impact so devastating? And what did we learn? Let's take a look.
We will provide discussion questions throughout the tour. When you see a slide that looks like this, feel free to pause the video and take time to discuss with your class before resuming the tour. The questions will also be provided in a full list at the end of the video. In part 1, we'll provide some historic background.
To understand Hurricane Katrina, you need a bit of New Orleans history. Native Americans first lived on this area of high ground, and they showed it to French settlers. Its location on the Mississippi River gave it access to land upriver as well as the Gulf of Mexico, so the city thrived as a center for trade and travel. Even today, New Orleans is the 4th most productive port in the United States. As you can see, being close to water helped New Orleans to flourish, but it has always presented challenges. Before the creation of human-made levees, the area around the Mississippi River flooded regularly. Native Americans who lived in this region developed technologies and ways of life that allowed them to live with water. After the invasion of European colonists, population around the Mississippi River and settlements increased, which meant that flooding would cause devastating property loss and loss of life. Interventions such as human-made levees can even sometimes increase the risk of devastating floods.
Water shaped New Orleans physically, culturally, and economically. How was water part of your environment?
In 1965, Hurricane Betsy brought a 10-foot storm surge to New Orleans. It was the first hurricane to cause $1 billion worth of damage, which earned it the nickname Billion Dollar Betsy. Some of the same effects of this hurricane, such as widespread power failure and flooding, would happen again in 2005 during Hurricane Katrina.
In part 2, we'll discover what happened during and after Hurricane Katrina.
Let's take a quick look at the days leading up to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. On Tuesday, August 23rd, Tropical Depression 12 formed over the southeastern Bahamas. By the next day, August 24th, the depression became Tropical Storm Katrina. By Thursday, August 25th, it was upgraded to a Category 1 hurricane. Just 3 days later, on August 28th, it became a Category 5 hurricane, and Mayor Ray Nagin issued the first ever mandatory evacuation order for the city of New Orleans.
This map shows New Orleans in the projected path of Hurricane Katrina.
At 10:11 a.m. on August 28th, Robert Ricks at the National Weather Service in Slidell, Louisiana, issued this dire warning. Most of the area will be uninhabitable for weeks, perhaps longer. At least 1/2 of well-constructed homes will have roof and wall failure. Airborne debris will be widespread. Person, pets, and livestock exposed to the winds will face certain death if struck. Water shortages will make human suffering incredible by modern standards. It was very unusual for a weather service warning to use such extreme language. Ricks was trying to convince people to obey the mandatory evacuation order. Some believe that the severity of this warning may have saved lives. Do you think you would stay in New Orleans if the city issued a mandatory evacuation order? As this tour continues, consider, why did some people stay in New Orleans? The eye of Hurricane Katrina passed east of New Orleans at 9 a.m. on August 29, 2005. At that time, it was a Category 3 hurricane. The levees protecting New Orleans were poorly designed and constructed, which caused widespread levee failure when the storm surge reached the city. 80% of New Orleans flooded. The water rose quickly, forcing many residents into desperate situations. Judith Buffon and her teenage daughter had to climb into their attic to escape the rising water. As the water continued to rise, they used this hatchet to break through the attic ceiling and climb onto the roof. This hatchet may have saved them from drowning. The aftermath of Hurricane Katrina stretched on for long, hot days. People struggled to survive in the flooded city without electricity, food, or access to fresh water. Many people suffered, and more than 1,800 people died. Stephen J. Ford used this handmade pirogue to rescue relatives and neighbors who had been stranded by the floodwaters. These are the clothes he wore on those rescue missions. He is just one example of the many residents who took heroic action to help others in the days after Hurricane Katrina.
We went to the front of the attic and kicked out the window. We could hear and feel the rain. I felt the rain. It felt like sand when it hit me. I had to rub my face to make sure it was water. But the roof inside the attic felt like it was breathing. It was pulsating from the wind. One point I started singing. I sang a few songs. I remember the Riders on the Storm. That's what we were, Riders on the Storm. Riders on the Storm. It was quite a few people in dire straits, and I pulled some people out of the attic. They weren't able to break out of the attic. I moved people that were alone on the roof to roofs where they had people. My son previously had dropped off 2 boxes of MREs. I had a case and a half of bottled water and 2 boxes of MREs, and that made me very comfortable and proud to be heroic in some people's eyes. When you get an opportunity to help somebody, that's an opportunity, you know. You don't want to miss that.
When Hurricane Katrina reached New Orleans, some doctors, nurses, patients, and hospital staff were sheltering in some of the city's hospitals. Some of them became stranded by the floodwaters and left without power. The patients and staff at Charity Hospital made this banner. They hung it outside of a window to show that they were still there and they still needed help.
I was in this isolation room, freezing to death, and then Katrina hits. You know, lying in bed, not able to do much. I looked at the walls, I looked at the construction, and said, well, I'll be fine here, I'm sure. And about that time, the winds really started to pick up. And a group of nurses were going down the hall, and a nurse would come in and say, we need to get everybody out in the hall, you know. And I said, oh, you guys are crazy. I see, this is just good sleeping weather. And I got up and rolled up the blinds and was like, oh, no. I mean, things were blowing upwards, not just sideways. They transferred us all out in the hall, in our beds. Some of the windows were being blown out. That was probably the big reason. We, I think, stayed out in the hall about 3 hours. And then we lost all power after about 2 hours. And that was it. We had no word after this. We had no communication. We were basically on our own for 5 days. But I got to say that the nurses performed amazingly well. I will always say this for the rest of my life. To be a charity hospital nurse, you really truly understand compassion in a way that most people don't even know.
Football fans across the United States will recognize the Superdome where the New Orleans Saints play. The Superdome served as a shelter of last resort during Hurricane Katrina. Approximately 10,000 people rode out the storm from the Superdome, but the population there swelled to 35,000 in the days following the hurricane as residents fled their flooded homes. They lacked adequate food, water, power, and basic supplies. People struggled to maintain order and to just stay alive. 3 people died in the Superdome. These seats were in the Superdome during Hurricane Katrina.
We didn't get inside the dome. We didn't want to get inside the dome because the doors were open and the smell that came out of that place is something I've never smelled before. I mean, it was fetid, horrible, horrible smells. And there were people, they said there were babies sleeping inside there still, and I don't know how anybody could have stood that tremendous odor. And it's absolutely horrible, horrible.
When we entered the Superdome, we were walking in water. We had came out of water, but we were walking in urine and feces. Everywhere I looked, there were faces. So I'm gonna give a conservative estimate that you had at least 20,000 people plus in that Superdome. No lights, no running water, no ventilation system.
How do you think shelters can be better prepared to assist residents during an emergency? Hurricane Katrina caused a widespread power outage, and it destroyed communication systems. People could not reach first responders to request help, and first responders did not know where to deliver supplies. People who had evacuated from the city couldn't reach family members and friends that had stayed behind, and rumors of civil breakdown caused delays in the delivery of emergency supplies. During the storm, local journalists performed bravely. The Times-Picayune continued to publish online as events unfurled, and they managed to print a paper version of the Times-Picayune newspaper just 4 days after Hurricane Katrina. What strategies and technologies can help us communicate during a power outage? First responders, such as police, firefighters, the National Guard, and the Coast Guard, helped many people after Hurricane Katrina. The Coast Guard alone rescued 24,000 people. However, poor emergency management meant that supplies and emergency evacuation transportation did not arrive quickly enough after the storm. At times, the atmosphere of fear and uncertainty led to rising tensions between first responders and the residents. Tommy Elton Mabry wrote this diary on the walls of an apartment in the B.W. Cooper housing development. It began the day before Hurricane Katrina and extended through October 2005. The diary reveals the difficult conditions of living in the catastrophically damaged city in the days after Hurricane Katrina and the emotional strain of living in that situation. Some residents did not have the means to leave the city before Hurricane Katrina hit. They may have had health issues, lacked transportation, or simply had nowhere else to go. Hurricane Katrina exposed pre-existing racial inequalities in the city of New Orleans. A history of discriminatory housing practices and poverty rooted in systemic racism meant that Black communities often had fewer resources to withstand the storm and recover from it. African American communities struggled to rebuild. Even 15 years after Hurricane Katrina, the Black population was only at 70% of its pre-storm level in New Orleans. After Hurricane Katrina, first responders painted these symbols on homes to show that a house had been searched. The top quadrant showed the date the house was searched. To the left was a code showing the agency that had searched the house. The right quadrant showed whether there were any existing hazards inside, and the bottom quadrant revealed whether any people were found in the house and whether they were alive or dead. You can still see some of these symbols around New Orleans today. Some homeowners have even repainted or preserved the X symbol.
Now, in part 3, we'll discuss why did the hurricane have such a devastating impact?
Many people knew that a hurricane of this size could have a devastating impact on New Orleans. In 1990, a representative of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers said, "The whole of Orleans and Jefferson parishes could be under 13 feet to 15 feet of water with a slow-moving Category 3 storm, depending on its path." Even with this prior knowledge, the city was not prepared for Hurricane Katrina. Poorly designed levees, decades of wetlands loss, and inadequate disaster management exacerbated some of the worst effects of the storm. Though Hurricane Katrina was a natural disaster, its worst impacts were human-made. How does it make you feel knowing that some of the worst impacts of Hurricane Katrina were predicted years in advance? During Hurricane Katrina, the levees and flood protection system failed in 50 locations around New Orleans. Some levees were overtopped by high floodwaters, but others were breached due to poor construction and design. For example, Iowa levees fell because they lack a solid foundation. They become more unstable as soil washes away and water pressure is applied to one side. Iowa levees failed at the 17th Street, London, and Industrial Canals in New Orleans.
We were flooded because there were design flaws in the federal levees. They failed. We flooded. This is the Industrial Canal, which runs from the Mississippi River to Lake Pontchartrain with a direct link with Mr. Go. In this section is one of the dramatic failures. This levee was an eye wall. Its sheets were too short, it had underseepage, overtopping, and basically failed in quite a few places. The old section of the city was gutted by the failures on 17th Street Canal in London. The 17th Street Canal was basically a slide. There was a soils layer with short sheets. The water was allowed to go underneath those sheets, and it caused the wall to slide into the backyards of the people that lived on Bel Air Drive. The breach was 400 feet long and to a depth of 20 feet below sea level. The amount of water that this allowed into the city was tremendous.
You can see here that an eye wall levee is unstable. A T-wall levee is much more stable and much harder to move because it has a stronger foundation. After the storm, the Army Corps of Engineers admitted that the levee system was flawed and incomplete. Over thousands of years, sediment carried by the Mississippi River created and built up Louisiana's wetlands. Wetlands provide an important buffer for storm surge by absorbing water before it reaches heavily populated areas. However, Louisiana's wetlands are disappearing. Human-made levees halt the natural process that creates wetlands. Also, canal dredging for the oil and gas industries or draining for development diminishes the wetlands. Wetlands loss made New Orleans extremely vulnerable to flooding during Hurricane Katrina.
We lost 1,500 square miles of marsh between the middle of the 20th century and the end of the 20th century. It's gone now. And so what it means in the 21st century is that when storms come in, there's not much between cities like New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico. There's not much in the way of barrier islands, there's not much in the way of marsh, and there are very large areas of open water. So the storms approach quickly, the storm surge builds up very rapidly, and cities like New Orleans are more vulnerable.
The city, state, and nation were not prepared to deal with the disaster of Hurricane Katrina's magnitude. The city of New Orleans did not have a plan in place to help residents evacuate the city if they did not have transportation. The State Emergency Office and FEMA did not have a plan to deliver supplies or rescue residents after the storm. This caused deadly delays in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina.
How can we use information about levees, wetlands, and disaster management to prepare for future hurricanes? In Part 4, we'll discuss what we learned and how you can get involved.
After Hurricane Katrina, residents returned to New Orleans and the Gulf Coast to rebuild their communities. People from across the country and around the world donated to or participated in the rebuilding effort. But the work is not finished. Global climate change will cause sea levels to rise and may increase the severity of future storms, which places the Gulf Coast at an even greater risk for floods. We learned many things from Hurricane Katrina, including the need for better designed flood protections or flood-resilient infrastructure, the importance of preserving and restoring Louisiana's wetlands, and the need for a well-designed disaster management plan that includes a safe evacuation strategy for all residents, as well as organized emergency response. There are many things that you can do to prepare for future storms and lessen their impact. First, make sure you and your family are prepared for any hurricanes or natural disasters. Make an emergency supply kit that you can use whether you shelter in place or go to an evacuation shelter. Make a family evacuation plan that has many different routes and places to shelter depending on the path of any particular storm. Make sure you pay attention to any state or city evacuation orders.
How has your household prepared for natural disasters? What else can you do to prepare?
Stay informed about disaster management in your city and community. You can advocate for measures that protect wetlands or improve stormwater management in your neighborhood. You can volunteer for organizations that help with city evacuations or talk to your neighbors about storm preparedness.
How can you help your community prepare for natural disasters?
You can also stay informed about disaster management at the state and national level. You can advocate for policies that fight climate change. You can even pursue a career in one of the many areas connected to disaster management, such as engineering, design, community activism, social work, or communications. Pick an area of disaster management that matters to you and learn more.
How might you get involved in disaster management on a state or national scale? Are you considering any careers related to this field?
What do you think are the most important lessons learned from Hurricane Katrina? And what can you do to make sure that you, your family, and your community are prepared for future storms? Thank you for touring this exhibition with us today. I hope you learned more about Hurricane Katrina and the importance of being prepared for hurricanes.